He was Khal Drogo, the great Khal of the Dothraki Sea, the man whose braid had never been cut, whose enemies lined the grasslands in unmarked graves and feeding crows. His entire life had been dedicated to riding across vast plains beneath a merciless sun, the thunder of hooves trailing in his wake, as entire villages bowed or bled before his khalasar. Strength was not just a currency among the Dothraki, it was survival, religion, and a way of life. And Drogo stood among them as a colossus of strength, impossible to humble or best in battle. Yet, for all his might, for all his unwavering pride, a single event threatened to unravel the destiny he believed unassailable. He had married Daenerys Targaryen. The silver-haired woman was strange to his eyes at first, pale-skinned and delicate, but she carried a fire in her spirit that matched the flames in his own heart. More importantly, she carried with her the claims of a lost dynasty and a promise that meant little at first to a Dothraki warlord. But as time wove them closer, her determination lit something in him, an ember of curiosity about a foreign land he had, until then, deemed unworthy of his notice. He would soon learn that these 7 kingdoms were no mere rumor. They were a place of stone castles, steel swords, and cunning men who played at politics the way Dothraki played with blades. Still, Drogo was no fool. He recognized the wealth and opportunities that could be seized if he brought his khalasar across the Great Salt Sea. He understood Daenerys' desire to take back the Iron Throne that had once belonged to her father. His blood riders, initially dismissive of the idea of crossing the ocean, had begun to see the glimmer in their Khal's eyes whenever Daenerys spoke of Westeros. And most of all, they recognized that Drogo did not make idle oaths. He had promised her the Iron Throne. So, he resolved to do what no Dothraki warlord had ever done. Truly cross the sea, not just raiding towns along the coasts, but leading a full invasion. The thought stoked flames in the hearts of his warriors. They craved conquest. They lived for the song of steel on steel and the pride of subjugating entire lands. Westeros, that fabled continent of knights and kings, beckoned. Yet the crossing itself posed challenges. The Dothraki were notoriously reluctant to sail, calling the seas accursed poison waters. But faith in Khal Drogo overcame their superstitions. He was the stallion who would mount the world, after all. Or so said the prophecies whispered among the Dash Khaleen. If he commanded that they build or seize ships, they would. If he said they must cross, they would. Their loyalty came not from fear alone, but also from wonder, a fervor that was almost religious in its intensity. Daenerys assisted him in these efforts, calling upon old loyalists to House Targaryen, mustering gold from secret supporters in Essos, and even forging alliances with disgruntled merchants who recognized the staggering potential for profit if the entire Dothraki horde were unleashed on Westeros. It took months of effort, the forging of alliances, and seizing or hiring hundreds of ships to ferry horses and warriors alike across the narrow sea. By then, news traveled fast across the free cities and doubtlessly reached the ears of Westeros. But the lords across the sea took it as the usual rumor, stories of a would-be Targaryen princess with a savage husband, too proud or too insane to think that they could ever threaten the might of the 7 kingdoms. Hadn't the last Targaryens been scattered to the winds? And hadn't the Dothraki always been land-bound, too cowardly to venture far across treacherous waters? That is what the small folk said. The lords and ladies, suspicious of news from Essos, dismissed the entire notion as half-mad gossip. Surely the seas would devour these savages, or storms would break their ships. Even if they arrived, the strength of Westeros, from the north to the Stormlands, would rise in unison to meet them. But Khal Drogo was no mere savage warlord. He was cunning in ways that Westeros did not expect. Rather than sail for King's Landing, where the might of the Iron Throne stood, or Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen, Drogo commanded his fleet to land first on the shores of Dorne, at a remote spot where the watchtowers were sparse. Daenerys' knowledge, gleaned from ancient texts and her own careful inquiries, suggested that crossing at a vulnerable point might buy them precious days to disembark and establish themselves on land. And so they landed under cover of darkness, the waves lapping at their ships as the desert winds of Dorne swept across dunes and rocky crags. For the first time, the Dothraki felt foreign sands under their feet that were not part of Essos. The stirring of excitement clashed with trepidation, for the land was as hot and harsh as the stories said. Drogo's horse was the first to disembark, and he rode it inland, the moonlight revealing the yawning emptiness ahead. With barely a pause, the Khalasar followed, hooves kicking up clouds of dust in the Dornish night. At dawn, they found their first village. Word spread like wildfire. Strangers had arrived in the night, an army of fierce riders. As the sun crested the horizon, the first real battle in the Dothraki invasion was joined. A small retinue of Dornish knights arrived to investigate rumors of raiders near the coast. With them were a few mounted soldiers and some archers. They found themselves facing thousands of braided riders, each brandishing an arak, each horse painted with strange designs, their riders chanting war cries in a tongue none of the Dornishmen understood. The confrontation ended swiftly. Arrows flew, but the Dothraki thundered forth in an unstoppable charge that overwhelmed the knights almost instantly. Those who survived sped off to warn the local lords. Blood warmed the desert sand where the fallen knights lay scattered. Khal Drogo looked upon the carnage with satisfaction. This would be the first of many such engagements. He would paint Westeros red in the name of his queen. Daenerys, in her own way, understood the magnitude of what they had begun. She was no longer the timid girl at the mercy of her brother's whims. Now she stood by the side of a powerful warlord, guiding him with her knowledge of Westeros, even as she learned to command the devotion of the Dothraki who came to revere her as the Khaleesi. She had no illusions about the bloodshed they would wreak upon this continent, but she also felt the pull of destiny. The Iron Throne was her birthright, and she believed, in some deep part of her heart, that the stallion who mounts the world would unite the known kingdoms under one rule. The early days of their invasion tested the Dothraki's adaptability. Dornish deserts were not identical to the Dothraki Sea. Water was less plentiful, the terrain rockier, and the local people were adept at guerrilla tactics. At first, the Khalasar simply crushed small outposts and settlements, riding over them with typical Dothraki ferocity. But soon, more organized Dornish defenders emerged, harassing the edges of Drogo's force, stinging like desert scorpions and retreating into the arid hills. The largest Dornish houses, nominally loyal to the Iron Throne, found themselves in a quandary. Should they rally all their forces to repel this invasion immediately, or wait for reinforcements from King's Landing or Highgarden? Khal Drogo understood enough about warfare to know that lingering in Dorne too long was a mistake. He gave the order. The Dothraki would move north, seeking greener lands for their horses and more valuable plunder. Daenerys advised him to push along the coast, capturing or intimidating small ports to ensure they had lines to the sea. Those ships that had carried them across might become critical supply lines. And so they went forth in a series of swift raids, leaving frightened villages behind them, collecting supplies, gold, and horses from every corner they passed. In her heart, Daenerys hated the suffering it brought upon the small folk. But she also knew that the Dothraki only understood one language, conquest. She could not deny the savage grace with which they swept across the land. As news traveled up the bone-dry roads of Dorne, the rest of Westeros began to stir. Ravens flew to King's Landing, to Storm's End, to Highgarden, to Winterfell. The new king on the Iron Throne, whomever wore the crown after Robert Baratheon's rebellion, for this was a hypothetical realm where certain details might have changed, was faced with the horrifying news. The Dothraki had truly come, and with them a Targaryen claimant. It was a threat none could ignore, for the realm was not as united as it once was under the old Targaryen kings. The Seven Kingdoms were fractious, each major house grappling with its own ambitions and fears. Some might see a potential alliance with the Targaryen queen if she could be swayed to favor them. Others would see only the destruction that these savage hordes would bring. Khal Drogo's approach to diplomacy was straightforward: pay homage or face ruin. But Daenerys pushed him to consider alliances with houses that might feel alienated by the Iron Throne, to gather supporters who remembered the Targaryen reign with fondness or believed her presence would bring stability. The Dothraki had never negotiated in such a manner, but Drogo indulged his Khaleesi's counsel because he recognized her insights and the value of having at least some local alliances. A cunning few Dornish lords came forth, pledging to guide the Khalasar away from their strongholds in exchange for promises of lesser destruction or a share in future spoils. Khal Drogo would never rely on these men wholly, but he accepted their knowledge of the land. Secret passes, hidden wells, vantage points to avoid or ambush. It gave him a crucial edge in navigating a continent that was entirely unfamiliar to his riders. Still, battles and skirmishes were constant. The famed Dornish cavalry, riding swift sand steeds, clashed repeatedly with the Dothraki outriders. At times, the Dornish scored victories, picking off stragglers and employing cunning ambushes to slow the horde. But these efforts were pinpricks against an ocean of horsemen. Khal Drogo responded by unleashing wave after wave of Dothraki raiders, burning villages suspected of aiding the enemy. The local population grew terrified, torn between cooperating with the invaders or rallying to defend their homeland. In a matter of weeks, the entire southern coastline of Westeros was aflame with chaos, a confusion of shifting allegiances and desperate attempts to contain the unstoppable cavalry swarm. Daenerys, observing the fear in the eyes of those they conquered, felt pangs of empathy. She remembered her own helplessness as a young girl, forced to flee the only home she ever knew, though it was a home she'd never truly seen. King's Landing, the Red Keep, always a memory of whispered stories. She tried to temper Drogo's harshest instincts, urging mercy where possible, especially for women and children. Some of the Dothraki warlords grumbled at her softness, but Drogo's word was absolute. He admired Daenerys for her gentleness, finding it a curious contrast to his own nature, yet somehow complementary. He would not have his Khaleesi's commands openly defied. Through him, she found a measure of control over the tide of destruction, though it remained a violent wave all the same. Moving north, the Khalasar eventually reached the fertile marches between Dorne and the Reach. Here, broad farmland and vineyards sprawled under a kinder sun. This was what Drogo's warriors had been waiting for: rich fields, abundant water, and scattered hamlets ripe for pillaging. They feasted on grain, seized livestock, and reveled in the spoils of war. Alarmed lords of the Reach began mustering their forces. The Tyrells, who ruled from Highgarden, recognized the existential threat of a roaming horde that might ravage their bountiful lands. Rumors swirled that a massive host was being organized by the Reach, potentially supplemented by levies from the crown. If the Dothraki were not checked soon, the prosperity of the entire region would wither under their hooves. Khal Drogo relished the challenge. Every day, more warriors flocked to his banner, drawn by the legend of the great Khal who had dared to cross the poison water. Word from Essos told of smaller Khalasars merging into this unstoppable force, taking ships and following in Drogo's wake, drawn to a continent ripe for the plundering. The tension in Westeros mounted, for now the horde's numbers swelled beyond initial estimates. Even some ironborn pirates, lured by rumors of spoils, began raiding the coasts in Drogo's shadow, complicating the realm's response even further. Chaos blossomed like a poisonous flower, and amidst it all rode Daenerys Targaryen, an exiled princess leading a savage invasion of the very land she once hoped to call home. Yet she maintained her vision. She wanted the Iron Throne not as a seat of fire and death, but as a symbol of her family's rightful place. She knew she must eventually confront the king in King's Landing, whether that king was a Baratheon, Lannister, or another pretender. But to do so too hastily would be suicide. Drogo also understood the principle of wearing down the enemy, seizing riches and forging a reputation that would strike terror into the hearts of any who opposed them. If the lords were frightened enough, they might abandon the monarchy to its fate. Some might even rise in rebellion, seeing an opportunity to shift the balance of power. It was not all that different from how Dothraki Khalasars vied for supremacy on the grasslands. The first major confrontation came near the Mandar, the great river of the Reach. There, a joint force of Reachmen and Crown forces attempted to trap the Dothraki. They had built makeshift fortifications, stationed archers along the riverbanks, and prepared a cavalry force in the rear to strike at any Dothraki flanking maneuvers. Thousands of soldiers stood ready, a grand army of steel and banners. It was said the banners of Tyrell, Hightower, Oakhart, and others fluttered in the breeze, blending with the crown's own sigil if the current occupant of the throne was a Baratheon or a Lannister. Trumpets sounded, knights formed lines, and the occasional glimmer of a war horn echoed across the water. The Dothraki paused, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Westerners fought in formation, wore heavier armor, and carried large shields, which made them formidable when they remained disciplined and could not be easily outflanked. Khal Drogo arrayed his khalasar, archers on horseback, savage riders with araks and whips, and on the flanks, blood riders who commanded smaller groups. Daenerys, mounted on her silver, observed from a rise. She felt the hammering of her heart, remembering stories of how the Targaryens once used dragons to break entire armies. She had no dragons now, only the unstoppable courage of a Dothraki horde. She prayed it would be enough. At Drogo's command, the Dothraki advanced swiftly, their front a chaotic wave of riders weaving unpredictably to evade arrow volleys. The ground trembled beneath thousands of galloping hooves. The defenders launched their own arrows, skewering some riders, but the Dothraki pressed on. When they closed the distance, the archers on horseback returned fire, picking off men on the walls of the fortifications. Then came the savage charge. Knights braced behind their shields, lances leveled, while foot soldiers huddled to form spear lines. The two forces met in a deafening clash of steel and flesh. Horses screamed, men tumbled, the lines bent and heaved. A swirling maelstrom of slaughter erupted. At first, the disciplined Western lines held, but the Dothraki hammered them from multiple angles, exploiting any gap with lethal speed. Many knights found themselves outflanked, their heavy armor offering little advantage when pinned by multiple riders. Seeing the chaos, a cavalry reserve led by some of the crown's finest knights attempted to sweep in from the left flank to turn the tide. The Dothraki, anticipating this, had stationed their own best riders there, led by Khal Drogo himself. He bellowed a war cry, brandishing his arak. His stallion thundered forward, and he crashed into the knights with unstoppable force. In close quarters, the Dothraki riders slashed at horses' legs, pulled knights from their saddles, and overwhelmed them with savage skill. Drogo personally engaged a powerful knight whose golden armor shone with intricate detail. They traded blows, sparks flying. The knight's sword struck Drogo's shoulder, drawing blood, but the Khal roared and swung his arak in a devastating arc, cleaving through the knight's visor. Blood sprayed, and the knight toppled. With their leader down, the cavalry reserve faltered. On the other side of the field, Daenerys watched tensely, flanked by her loyal handmaiden-turned-bodyguard who had learned to fight under the Dothraki. She saw lines break, men drown in the muddy banks of the Mander as they tried to flee, and the unstoppable momentum of the khalasar break the entire line of defenders. It was a horrific sight, yet she could not deny a swelling pride in the might of the force she had helped bring to these shores. Soon, the defenders were in full retreat. The Dothraki refused to give quarter. They chased them down along the river, cutting off escape routes and slaughtering any who stood in their path. By sundown, the battlefield belonged to Drogo. This victory proved a watershed moment. Across Westeros, the realization sank in that the Dothraki horde could not be easily thwarted by conventional tactics. Some lords began withdrawing to their castles, preferring to fortify rather than meet the invaders in open field. Others tried to placate the Targaryen queen with offers of support or surrender, hoping to be spared the wrath of the Dothraki. Daenerys and Drogo, however, found it more advantageous to keep marching, punishing any sign of resistance. The khalasar took Highgarden next, not by siege, but by intimidation and betrayal within, as House Tyrell's vassals splintered under the unstoppable fear of Dothraki cavalry. Though the fortress was imposing, the Tyrells could not assemble enough men quickly enough to hold it against the entire horde. Some rumored that certain factions within the Tyrell bannermen opened side gates, hoping to avert a massacre. So it did not matter. The city fell in less than a fortnight. The cost in blood was high, but the reward was immense. A seat of power in the Reach, whose lands were filled with bounties of grain and wine. At Highgarden, Daenerys saw the seat of a great house of Westeros for the first time. lush gardens, intricate architecture, and a storied hall where the lords of the Reach once presided. She walked through corridors that had likely never seen a Targaryen in decades. The Dothraki roamed the outer wards, restless and hungry for more conquest. She felt a strange sense of relief to finally have some sort of base in Westeros, though she knew they could not linger. The entire realm was still arrayed against them, and the Iron Throne would not remain idle. Word had it that a much larger royal host was gathering near King's Landing, with the might of the Lannisters or Baratheons or whoever sat the throne. Daenerys insisted that to secure her claim, she and Drogo must march onward, though she counseled carefully. She wanted to sow discord among the noble houses, to encourage them to rebel or to join her cause without forcing her to drown the continent in blood.